I still remember the day I arrived. The long drive from New York to Massachusetts had been both liberating and unsettling. After years of city life, I was eager to leave the rush, the crowds, the never-ending noise behind. All I wanted was a quiet, affordable space where I could focus on my work, maybe even figure myself out a little. And there it was, waiting for me on a quiet street, this ancient brick building with the kind of architecture that looked like it had secrets hiding in every shadowed corner. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Elkins, showed me around with minimal enthusiasm. He seemed nervous, as if he was eager to get me out of his sight. He handed me the keys, mumbled something about the quirks of the building, like the faulty wiring and creaky floorboards, and left me with an uncomfortable smile, avoiding eye contact. I brushed it off. I'd lived in old places before, and this place, with its chipped walls and dusty corners, had character. The first few nights were peaceful, almost too quiet. I was used to honking taxis, voices from the street, and even the thundering rumble of trains in the distance. Here, though, it was different. I could hear every sound within the walls, small creaks, occasional clinks from the pipes, and sometimes an odd tapping that seemed to come from nowhere in particular. I figured the place was settling in, like I was. On the fourth night, as I lay in bed reading, I heard it, a sound distinct from any of the usual quirks. It was soft, almost like a whisper, and I couldn't make out the words. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it, but as I lay still, listening, I heard it again, only slightly louder. My name, or at least what I thought was my name, echoing faintly from the walls. Jack, I told myself it was nothing, a neighbor's television maybe, or my mind playing tricks. The silence here was so deep that maybe it was creating echoes of things that weren't really there. I shook it off and went back to my book. But as I tried to read, the whisper wouldn't let me go. Every so often, I'd catch a breathy Jack, like a memory trying to claw its way into reality. The next morning, I went downstairs to the building's lobby, half embarrassed about what I was about to ask Mr. Elkins. I found him at his desk, sipping a coffee that smelled burnt. His eyes flicked up briefly before settling back down on his paperwork. "Hey, Mr. Elkins," I started, unsure of how to approach it. "Do you know if the walls here are thin? I keep hearing things. Could be a neighbor or maybe the pipes." He looked up, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of concern, maybe even a flash of regret. "You're in 4A, right?" His voice was cautious, like he was choosing each word with care. "Yeah." "Well," he said, looking away, "4B has been empty for a long time now. People come and go, but they don't stay for long." He looked down, then muttered under his breath, "Maybe it's just the building settling." The rest of the day I tried not to think about it. I went about setting up my desk, unpacking books, and rearranging furniture, telling myself I'd let it go. But something about Mr. Elkins's answer clung to me, a vague feeling of dread that I couldn't shake. When night fell again, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, half expecting the whisper to return. Hours passed in restless silence, and just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. "Jack." This time it was clearer, as if someone was just on the other side of the wall, whispering right into my ear. I froze, every nerve alert. My heart pounded as I forced myself to breathe, straining to make sense of the sound. It was unmistakably my name, said in a low, mournful tone, barely audible but clear enough to set every hair on my body on end. I stayed up, listening, waiting for it to happen again, but the whisper was gone. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. My mind raced through possibilities, wind in the walls, a draft, maybe even a leftover vibration from the street outside, but none of those explanations made sense. It had been my name, clear as day, like someone who knew me, or thought they did. In the days that followed, the whispers became more frequent, and they grew closer, more insistent. My name, again and again, in that same low, drawn-out voice. It didn't matter if I was in the kitchen, the bedroom, or the living room. I would feel a prickling sensation, a strange awareness, and then hear it, a faint but unmistakable whisper of Jack hanging in the air. I began to dread the nights, the hours when the world outside grew still, leaving only me and the whispers. Sleep became nearly impossible. I'd lie awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for the sound to start, feeling like prey waiting for the hunter to make a move. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak louder, and every passing hour felt heavier. pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. I thought about leaving, even searched for new apartments one night when I couldn't take it anymore. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe deep down I needed to know what or who was calling my name. And so I stayed, night after night, caught between fear and fascination, waiting for answers that would either drive me out or drag me deeper. After that night, it was as if the building itself had come alive, every wall and floorboard infused with a presence I couldn't ignore. During the day, I managed to push it all to the back of my mind. But at night, alone in the darkness, the whispers became bolder, louder. Every so often, I thought I felt a slight vibration, as though someone were pacing on the other side of the wall, just feet from my bed. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of my surroundings, every creak and shudder amplified by the silence. My routine became tense and erratic. I was snapping at coworkers on calls, struggling to focus, and avoiding phone calls from my family. But I couldn't tell them what was happening here, not without sounding crazy. One evening, around 2 a.m., the tapping began. It wasn't loud, just a subtle rhythmic sound coming from somewhere near my bedroom wall. I lay there, my body tense, hoping it would fade away, but it didn't. It continued, tapping out an unsettling rhythm that seemed almost like a message. I tried to convince myself it was just the pipes or the building shifting, but that didn't explain the whispers, the way they echoed right inside my skull. The tapping grew faster, more insistent, and then suddenly it stopped. Silence settled over the apartment like a thick blanket, and for a moment I let out a breath, relieved. But then my phone buzzed, breaking the quiet. It was a notification, a simple reminder I'd set days before. But something about the timing was off, almost intentional. Unable to sleep, I sat up in bed, and before I could stop myself, glanced over at the wall between my apartment and 4B. The idea was absurd, but it was the only thought that made sense. I needed to know if someone or something was in that empty apartment. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and stood in front of my bedroom wall, knocking twice, firmly, where I thought I'd heard the tapping. Nothing. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear the slightest response, but only silence greeted me. Feeling foolish, I lowered my hand, letting out a shaky laugh. But just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. 2 knocks, echoing back through the wall, faint but unmistakable. My heart stopped. I stumbled backward, flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it, but then from the darkness a voice, soft, barely more than a whisper, came through the wall. "Help me!" The voice was faint, hoarse, as if whoever spoke had been whispering for hours, maybe even days. I stood there, frozen, as the silence stretched out around me. My mouth felt dry, my skin cold. I wanted to call out, ask who they were, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I slowly backed out of the bedroom, grabbed my jacket, and stumbled out of the apartment into the hallway. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, locking the door behind me. I told myself I was going to knock on 4B's door, demand answers. But when I reached the door, my courage failed. I stared at the old, chipped wood, imagining someone, something, waiting on the other side, listening. As I stood there debating my next move, I heard footsteps on the staircase. Turning quickly, I saw Mr. Elkins making his way up. His face was cast in shadow, but I could see his surprise when he noticed me standing there. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" he asked, his voice a gruff whisper. I stammered, trying to think of an excuse, but the words that came out were ones I hadn't planned. "Mr. Elkins, who lived here before me?" He stiffened, glancing toward my door, then back at 4B. For a moment he hesitated, his eyes avoiding mine. "4B's been empty for years," he muttered. "People don't stay long here, kid. It's best you don't go poking around." "But someone," I started, my voice rising despite myself. "There's someone in there. I heard them calling for help." He shook his head, a faint tremor in his hand. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, "places remember things best forgotten. I'd stay out of it if I were you." I wanted to press him, to make him admit whatever it was he was hiding. But before I could say another word, he brushed past me, muttering something about needing to check on something downstairs. As he disappeared down the stairs, I was left standing there, alone with my thoughts and the echo of that desperate voice calling out for help. When I returned to my apartment, everything felt colder, darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like I'd crossed an invisible line. Whatever I'd heard, whatever was happening in 4B, wasn't meant for me to understand. But now, I was a part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every corner of the apartment seemed to pulse with an invisible, watchful presence, and every shadow felt like a pair of eyes fixed on me. Even during the day, as light poured through the dusty windows, I felt trapped, suffocated by a sense of impending dread. And when night fell, the apartment became something else entirely, a place that wasn't mine, where I was the intruder. The whispers were more frequent now, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, desperate, as though whoever, or whatever it was, knew I was listening. My sleep, already frayed, had dwindled to mere minutes each night, a series of fractured, haunted dreams that left me exhausted and on edge. It was a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. One evening, I found myself pacing, trapped in a cycle of restless agitation. My thoughts kept returning to the other side of the wall, to that door, 4B, and to the voice that had called for help. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what lay behind that door. I grabbed my flashlight and stood outside my apartment, staring at 4B, feeling a strange mix of dread and resolve. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked. But to my shock, the knob turned, and the door creaked open, revealing the darkened apartment beyond. The air was thick, stifling, carrying a scent I couldn't place, something old, musty, mixed with an almost metallic tang that made me nauseous. Inside, the space felt abandoned, forgotten. Dust lay thick over the furniture, and cobwebs clung to every corner. I took a cautious step inside, my footsteps muffled by the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The faint beam of my flashlight danced over the walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to ripple as I moved, like they were alive, watching me. I moved through the room slowly, the whispers growing louder, filling my head until I could barely think. I couldn't tell if they were coming from within the apartment or from inside me, but their intensity grew with each step. At last, I reached the bedroom, the source of the whispers, the place where the voice had called out to me. There on the wall was something that made my skin crawl. Scratched deep into the peeling wallpaper, in jagged, frantic letters, was my name, over and over again. Jack. Each letter seemed to pulse, as if written in some fevered urgency. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached out, touching the wall, feeling the rough edges of the scratches beneath my fingertips. And then I heard it again. Jack, help me. The voice was right behind me, so close I could feel the chill of its breath on my neck. I spun around, but the room was empty. Only shadows filled the space, pressing in on me, watching, waiting. I felt trapped, like the walls were closing in, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. Something kept me rooted there, as though the room itself was holding me in place, demanding that I listen. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. For a moment, the whispers stopped. Silence filled the room, thick and oppressive, before a single word echoed back to me, faint and broken: Samuel. The name triggered something deep within me, a memory I couldn't quite grasp, like a shadow slipping through my mind. I knew that name. It was the name of the previous tenant, the man who'd disappeared. My pulse quickened as I realized what this meant. Samuel was here, or something of him was, trapped in the walls of this cursed apartment, calling out to me. And then I understood. He hadn't disappeared. He'd been consumed, swallowed by whatever darkness lingered here, and now it was reaching out to me, as if hoping to pull me in, to claim me as it had claimed him. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against something cold and metallic. I looked down, seeing a small, rusted key resting on the floor, covered in a thin layer of dust. I didn't know how it got there, but I felt an overwhelming compulsion to take it, as though it was the only way out. I grabbed the key, feeling its cold weight in my hand, and backed toward the door. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more desperate, pleading with me to stay, to help, to understand. But I couldn't. I had to get out before I, too, became part of whatever haunted this place. I ran from 4B, slamming the door shut behind me, and staggered back into my apartment. The whispers continued, even louder, filling my head with a chaotic cacophony that threatened to drown out my thoughts. I clutched the key tightly, feeling its rough edges bite into my palm as I forced myself to focus, to breathe. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that it felt unnatural, wrong. I looked around, expecting something, anything to happen. But there was nothing, just silence and the lingering weight of the key in my hand. I thought I was safe, that whatever horror I'd unleashed had been locked away. But as I sank onto my bed, exhausted and drained, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The walls, the very walls around me, were covered in fresh scratches, the name Samuel carved over and over, each letter more frantic, more desperate, as if etched in a final, hopeless plea. And then from within those walls, a voice rose, soft and unmistakable. "Jack, help me." The words echoed through my apartment, a chilling reminder that whatever I'd discovered wasn't done with me. I stared at the walls, feeling their silent watch, realizing that I might never escape. I was trapped, bound to this place, just as Samuel had been. The voice faded, but I knew it would be back, that it would haunt me, night after night, until I, too, disappeared. The house was everything I had hoped for, small, secluded, and perfect for living alone. After years of sharing apartments and dorm rooms, I was finally stepping into my own space, one that felt like a quiet retreat from the world. The area was peaceful, too, nestled in the outskirts of Seattle, with tall trees surrounding the property and only a few neighbors down the road. It felt private, which was exactly what I wanted. On my first night, I walked through each room, taking in the creaky wood floors, the vintage fixtures, and the slightly musty smell that comes with age. The house had character, and I was eager to make it mine. It wasn't perfect, but I loved it. I unpacked some essentials, filled the fridge with food, and spent the evening arranging books on shelves, setting up my workspace, and putting little personal touches in each room. It was probably around 11 p.m. when I finally decided to go to bed. I remember carefully placing my keys on the small hook next to the front door, a habit of mine. I'd always been organized, a stickler for routines, and I liked knowing exactly where everything was. The feeling of being settled gave me a strange satisfaction as I turned off the lights and lay down, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in years. The next morning, as I stumbled into the kitchen still half asleep, I noticed something odd. My keys were sitting on the counter, far from the hook where I was certain I had left them. It was strange but easy enough to brush off. I had just moved in, after all, and there were boxes and belongings all over the place. I figured I must have placed them there and simply forgot. Shaking off the odd feeling, I poured myself a cup of coffee and got ready for the day. But the small disturbances didn't stop. Over the next few days, I kept finding little things out of place. A mug on the table when I swore I had washed it and put it back. A photo frame on my bedside table turned slightly, as though someone had picked it up and examined it. The curtains in the living room drawn, even though I always left them open to let in the morning light. Each time, I told myself I was simply forgetting, that I was still adjusting to the new house. But deep down, a seed of doubt was beginning to take root. After a particularly long day at work, I came home, kicked off my shoes, and immediately noticed that the living room rug was crooked. I hadn't touched it. I was sure of that. And yet there it was, out of alignment, almost like it had been shifted purposefully. I spent a long time staring at it, my pulse quickening, a strange chill running down my spine. But even then I brushed it off, forcing myself to rationalize it away. "It's just a rug," I muttered aloud, trying to break the eerie silence. Maybe it had slid when I was vacuuming. Maybe I just hadn't noticed. But my instincts were telling me otherwise. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, listening to every sound. The house was old, and the walls had their own noises. A creak here, a thump there. But the longer I listened, the more I felt like something was wrong, like I wasn't alone. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. I tried to focus on my breathing, counting backward from 100 to force myself to relax, and yet, sleep wouldn't come. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even in the bright light of day, the house seemed off. I started double-checking everything before leaving for work, making sure my belongings were exactly where I'd left them. I snapped a picture of the kitchen before I left one morning, just to reassure myself that everything would be the same when I returned. That evening, as I reviewed the photo, I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. One of the chairs at the dining table was pulled out. I hadn't touched it, and it hadn't been like that in the morning. I was sure of it. I stared at the photo and then back at the room, feeling the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My rational mind searched for explanations. Maybe I'd nudged it without realizing. Maybe it had been that way and I just hadn't noticed. But the strange, creeping feeling wouldn't go away. I was starting to question myself, to wonder if I was really as organized as I believed, or if, somehow, my memory was playing tricks on me. By the end of the week, I found myself obsessively checking each room every time I walked through the house. I counted the books on the shelf, made sure the kitchen utensils were arranged just so, double-checked the locks on every window. It felt exhausting, but I couldn't help it. Something didn't feel right, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. And yet, despite the creeping sense of unease, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Houses settle, objects get bumped, and memories are fallible. I repeated these things to myself, like a mantra, trying to quiet the growing unease gnawing at me. But as I stood in the middle of my kitchen, watching the shadows lengthen across the floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was here with me, moving through my home, altering my space, waiting for me to notice. It was around midnight when I first heard the sound, a barely audible creak coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom. I'd been half asleep, caught in that strange space between dreaming and waking, but the sound jolted me fully awake. For a moment, I lay there, perfectly still, my heart thudding as I strained to listen. Silence. Maybe it was just the house settling, I thought, clinging to the rational explanation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else. Something intentional. My pulse was racing, but I forced myself to get up, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. I opened my bedroom door, holding my breath as I looked down the hallway, expecting what exactly? I wasn't sure. The hallway was empty, bathed in faint moonlight filtering through the living room window. I let out a shaky breath, feeling silly, even as that gnawing feeling of unease crept back in. In the kitchen, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The chair was back in place, my keys were on the hook, and every cupboard and drawer was shut tight. I felt a strange mix of relief and frustration, wondering if I was somehow making myself see things that weren't there, if maybe all of this was in my head. I went back to bed, determined to put it out of my mind, but it was hours before I fell asleep. The next day, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just nerves, maybe a side effect of living alone for the first time. But that night, I heard it again, the same soft creak in the hallway, the same eerie silence that followed. I lay in bed, paralyzed, feeling the weight of my own fear pressing down on me. And then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible shuffle of footsteps, as if someone were moving slowly, deliberately, just outside my door. I sat up, my mind racing. I wanted to call someone, but who would believe me? I didn't even fully believe it myself. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door again, scanning the hallway, but once more, there was nothing there. My heart was still racing as I closed the door and locked it, sinking back into bed, determined to stay awake, to catch whoever or whatever was doing this. Over the next few nights, the disturbances grew. Every morning, I'd wake up to find something slightly out of place. The curtains in the living room would be drawn when I'd left them open. A glass I'd left on the counter was now in the sink, as though someone had used it. And each night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I'd hear those soft footsteps in the hallway, growing bolder, closer. One morning, I found something that sent a chill through me. On the kitchen counter, next to the sink, was a small faded note. It was an old grocery list, written in a shaky hand I didn't recognize. I stared at it, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. I hadn't left this here, and I didn't recognize the handwriting. It was as though someone had left it there on purpose, as if they wanted me to know they'd been there, moving through my space, leaving little traces for me to find. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my phone, calling the police. When they arrived, they checked every room, every corner, but found nothing. They told me there was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone else had been inside. They suggested that maybe I'd left the note myself, that maybe I was just stressed, but I knew the truth. Someone had been here, in my home, touching my things, watching me. I felt helpless as I watched them leave, my mind spinning with questions. Who could it be? How were they getting in? And most disturbing of all, why were they doing this? I tried to tell myself it was over, that maybe the intruder had just been a drifter or a prankster, someone looking for a cheap thrill. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, a constant, oppressive presence that seemed to hang over me, following me from room to room. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every creak, every small sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door again, closer this time, almost hesitant. I held my breath, listening, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. The door handle rattled softly once, then twice, as though someone were testing it, trying to see if it would open. I was frozen, my mind racing, every nerve on edge, and then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with unspoken threats. I waited, afraid to move, until the first light of dawn crept in through the window. In the morning, I found the door to the basement slightly ajar. I never went down there, hardly even thought about it. But now, as I stared at the open door, a feeling of dread settled over me. The police had checked it, I reminded myself, but now I wasn't so sure. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly descended the stairs, feeling the air grow colder with each step. At the bottom, I scanned the small, cramped space, feeling a shiver run down my spine as the beam of light passed over boxes and old furniture covered in dust. Everything seemed untouched, abandoned, except for a small, folded piece of paper lying in the center of the floor. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and unfolded it to reveal a single line, scrawled in the same shaky handwriting from the grocery list. "I like watching you sleep." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked the door, backing away as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The note slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the floor, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it again. My thoughts were a blur, a chaotic mess of fear and disbelief. This wasn't just someone sneaking into my home. This was personal, deliberate. Whoever this person was, they weren't just here to take things. They were here for me. The next morning, I felt a heaviness unlike anything I'd ever known. The realization of what was happening, of what this intruder's intentions might be, settled into my bones. I didn't feel safe, didn't feel like I could trust my own home. Every inch of it had been invaded, tainted by their presence. And no matter how hard I tried to push the fear away, it clung to me. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I started packing that day, throwing my essentials into a suitcase with trembling hands. My mind raced as I considered my options. Who could I call? Where could I go? The police had been no help. If they hadn't believed me then, they certainly wouldn't believe me now, not after finding that note. The words echoed in my mind. "I like watching you sleep." A sick reminder that whoever this person was, they weren't just a stranger. They knew me. And they were close. I forced myself to stay awake that night, refusing to let them catch me off guard. The house was silent, almost deceptively peaceful, and for a moment I let myself believe that maybe I'd scared them off, that the note was a final attempt to frighten me. But then, as the clock crept past 2 a.m., I heard it, a soft, almost playful creak coming from the hallway. The footsteps were back, slow and deliberate, moving closer. I held my breath, clutching my phone in one hand, ready to call for help, even though I knew it might be pointless. The sound stopped right outside my bedroom door, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, thick with anticipation. Then, to my horror, the door handle turned, ever so slightly, as though they were testing to see if I'd locked it. A part of me wanted to scream, to throw the door open and confront them. But I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, paralyzed by fear as I listened, waiting, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Finally, the handle released, and the footsteps receded, fading into the hallway. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for any sign of movement. When the sun finally rose, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but it was short-lived. I knew I couldn't spend another night here, couldn't live with this constant fear. I grabbed my bag, barely pausing to grab the last of my things, and left the house without looking back. I checked into a hotel on the other side of town, hoping that putting some distance between me and that house would ease the tension in my chest, help me feel safe again. But the unease followed me, a shadow I couldn't escape. That night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, every creak and murmur of the hotel felt amplified, as though the terror I'd left behind had somehow found its way to this place, lurking in the dark corners. I barely slept, and the morning brought little comfort. I went through my day in a daze, haunted by the feeling that someone was watching, following. Every stranger on the street seemed suspicious, every person in the hotel lobby a potential threat. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just the lingering fear from the house, but deep down, I knew I wasn't safe. The following day, as I sat in a coffee shop, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. My hand shook as I opened it, feeling a sick sense of dread as I read the message. "I hope you're comfortable at the hotel. I'll see you soon." My stomach dropped, my vision blurring as I tried to make sense of it. They knew where I was. They had followed me, and no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, they would always be one step ahead. Panic surged through me as I realized the full extent of what this meant. I wasn't just dealing with a random intruder. This was personal, deliberate. They were stalking me, watching me, waiting for the perfect moment. In a fit of desperation, I blocked the number, though I knew it was only a temporary solution. I left the coffee shop, my mind racing with questions and half-formed plans. I could leave the city, go somewhere far enough that they wouldn't find me. But the thought felt hollow. Wherever I went, I'd always be looking over my shoulder, always wondering if they'd managed to follow, if they'd found me again. That night, back at the hotel, I sat in bed, staring at the door, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and exhaustion. I considered calling the police again, but I knew how it would go. They'd say I was imagining things, that there was no real evidence. After all, no one else had seen the notes, the footsteps, the subtle shifts in my belongings. I was the only one who knew, the only one who believed. And that isolation, that helplessness, was almost worse than the fear itself. As the hours dragged on, I felt myself slipping, losing grip on the world around me. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow sharper, until I couldn't tell what was real and what was in my mind. I didn't know if the footsteps I heard in the hallway were real or if I was imagining them. Didn't know if the figure I glimpsed outside the window was actually there or just a trick of the light. But then, as the night wore on, I heard something that cut through the haze of fear like a knife. It was a soft, familiar whisper, coming from just outside the door. "Rachel." The sound sent a chill through me, a reminder that whoever they were, they knew my name. I froze, listening, my mind racing with panic. The whisper came again, soft, almost playful, as though they were enjoying the effect it had on me. And then, finally, I heard the soft click of the door unlocking, the slow creak as it opened, just an inch, just enough to let me know they were there. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear as the door slowly swung open. And in the faint light, I saw them, a shadowy figure, their face obscured, standing just beyond the threshold, watching me with a look that sent a shiver down my spine. They didn't say a word, didn't move, just stood there, letting the silence stretch out between us. And in that moment, I realized the full horror of what this meant. They weren't here to harm me, not yet at least. They were here to watch, to wait, to remind me that I was never truly alone, that wherever I went, they would follow. As they closed the door and faded into the shadows, I knew that this nightmare was far from over. This was just the beginning. When I moved to the quiet suburb outside Portland, Oregon, I was looking for solitude. The kind of peace that could only come from leaving the city, where every sound and shadow felt suffocating. My new house was perfect, modest, with just enough space for me, a wide yard, and tall, sturdy pines separating the property from the neighbors. From my back porch, I could see the Cascade Mountains in the distance, and the silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves or an occasional passing car. The first few weeks were a dream. Mornings, I'd sit on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun climb over the treetops, its warmth easing me into the day. My afternoons were dedicated to writing, my focus sharp and undisturbed. Evenings, I'd take a walk around the neighborhood, familiarizing myself with the quiet, winding streets. The people were reserved but polite, nodding as they passed by. I liked the privacy, the sense of freedom that came with it. The couple next door was the only mystery. I'd noticed them when I moved in. Evelyn and Mark, at least. That's what I gathered from a quick, hesitant introduction. They were about my age, mid-30s, with the kind of calm, blank expressions that could either be friendly or distant. I couldn't tell. I had nodded, mentioned something about being new, and they had only smiled, saying nothing. Since then, we'd barely exchanged glances, each sticking to our own routines. But then, I started noticing them watching me. At first, it was subtle, just small glances from their living room window when I stepped outside. I assumed it was curiosity, maybe they were cautious of strangers. But the longer I stayed, the more frequent it became. It didn't matter what time of day. When I looked over, at least one of them would be there, standing at the window, face partially hidden by the blinds. Evelyn would stand motionless, her face expressionless, while Mark, if he was there, would glance away as if he hadn't been watching at all. One evening, just after sunset, I went outside to water my plants. The air was cool, crisp, with a hint of pine and earth. I was enjoying the calm when I glanced up and saw them. Both of them, standing in their front window, holding watering cans of their own, watching me with that same blank stare. It was almost like they were imitating me, matching my movements precisely, as if mocking my actions. I laughed it off, though a strange unease settled in my stomach. People were quirky, I told myself. Maybe they found it funny or just didn't know how to socialize. It wasn't worth dwelling on. Over the next few days, the imitation continued, each instance slightly more unnerving than the last. If I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, I'd glance up and see them through their window, both of them holding mugs, taking sips in unison with me. If I jogged around the block, they'd be standing at the corner, watching me pass, their heads tilting in sync. I could feel their eyes on me even as I walked away. It was a game, I decided. They were doing this on purpose to get a reaction. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. I kept my gaze straight, refusing to acknowledge their presence, hoping it would bore them and they'd stop. But the more I ignored them, the closer they seemed to get. The glances turned into stares, the small imitations becoming full routines, as if they were living reflections of my own life. One night, I couldn't stand it any longer. I was in my living room, reading, trying to unwind, when I felt that familiar prickling sensation. I glanced toward the window, and there they were, standing just beyond the glass, staring in. Mark was looking directly at me, his face pressed so close that I could make out the faint outline of his breath fogging up the glass. Evelyn was just behind him, her eyes fixed on me, unblinking, unmoving. I stood up, walking to the window, anger bubbling up inside me. They didn't flinch, didn't move back, their faces still as blank as ever. I opened the window a crack and called out, "Is there something I can help you with?" They didn't respond, just stood there, watching. I could feel my pulse quickening, the silence stretching out, thick and uncomfortable. Just when I was about to close the window and walk away, Evelyn spoke. "We're just making sure everything's all right," she said, her voice soft, almost soothing, like she was speaking to a frightened animal. Mark nodded, his gaze unwavering. "We like to keep an eye on things around here." I wanted to yell, to demand they stop, but something in their tone, in the unyielding way they stared, made me hesitate. Instead, I shut the window, drawing the curtains tight. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with thoughts I couldn't quite grasp. They were just neighbors, I told myself, probably overprotective, maybe even harmless. But as I turned away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The rest of the night, I couldn't concentrate. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept imagining their faces, pressed against the glass, watching me with those unreadable expressions. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was overreacting, but deep down, a part of me knew there was something more. This wasn't just strange behavior, it was intentional, deliberate. I finally went to bed, trying to push the whole incident from my mind. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that just beyond the walls, in the dark of the night, they were still watching, waiting, their presence lingering in the back of my mind like a shadow that refused to disappear. The next morning, the memory of my neighbor's strange behavior lingered, but I tried to shake it off. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, hoping the fresh air would help clear my mind. The sun was just rising, casting warm light across the yard, and for a moment, I felt myself relax. But as I glanced toward their house, I felt that prickling unease again. Evelyn was standing in their front yard, facing my direction, holding a mug of coffee, mirroring my own pose. She didn't smile, didn't wave, just stared, a slight tilt to her head as if she were trying to study every move I made. I felt a chill, despite the warmth of the morning, and quickly went back inside. Throughout the day, I caught glimpses of Evelyn and Mark from my windows. They seemed to be moving around their house, watching me from different angles. If I went to the kitchen, they would appear in their kitchen window. If I sat down in my living room, I'd see them through their front room window, each time watching me with those blank, unreadable faces. It felt deliberate, like they were following me without ever stepping foot outside their property. By late afternoon, I'd had enough. I grabbed my keys and decided to go for a drive, hoping to clear my head. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced toward their house, half expecting to see them standing in the window. But this time, they weren't there. Relief washed over me as I drove away, putting distance between myself and that unsettling feeling. I was gone for about an hour, driving around town aimlessly, trying to get my thoughts in order. When I finally returned, the first thing I noticed was that my front door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it before leaving. I'd been double-checking it every time I left. My stomach twisted as I stepped inside, half expecting to find something missing or out of place. But everything looked exactly as I'd left it. As I walked through the rooms, though, I noticed something strange. My belongings were all where I'd left them, but certain objects had been slightly rearranged, just enough to make me notice. The books on the shelf were in a different order, the picture frames on the wall were tilted at odd angles, and the kitchen chairs had been moved, as if someone had been sitting in them. A sense of violation crept over me. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? Nothing was missing. No damage had been done. It was subtle enough to be dismissed as my own imagination if I tried to explain it to someone else. But I knew the truth. Someone had been in my house, and I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly who it was. I stormed outside, crossing the yard to their house. My heart was pounding as I knocked on their door, each second stretching out, amplifying the anger and fear boiling inside me. I half expected them to ignore me, but after a few moments, the door swung open, and there they stood, side by side, wearing matching blank expressions. I didn't waste any time. "Did you come into my house?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I'd intended. They exchanged a glance, a slight unsettling smile tugging at Evelyn's lips. "We're just being neighborly," she said, her tone so casual that it sent a shiver down my spine. "You looked like you could use some help." "Help," I echoed, disbelief and anger tightening in my chest. "I don't need help, and I certainly didn't invite you into my house." Mark chuckled, a low, humorless sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, we've been neighbors a long time. We just thought we'd make you feel welcome." They were both smiling now, but it wasn't a friendly smile. There was something dark, almost sinister, lurking behind those expressions. I backed away, feeling the weight of their gaze on me even as I turned and retreated to my house, my mind racing with questions and a creeping sense of dread. Once inside, I locked every door, every window, and drew the curtains. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, somehow peering through the walls, tracking my every move. For the rest of the evening, I kept my eyes fixed on the curtains, waiting for any shadow or sign of movement. As night fell, I tried to distract myself, but every noise, every creak of the house seemed amplified, each one sending my heart racing. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see their faces pressed against the glass, their expressions blank and unreadable, watching me from the darkness. My paranoia grew, consuming every thought, every breath, until finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and a camera, determined to catch them in the act if they tried anything again. I positioned myself by the window, peeking out just enough to keep an eye on their house without being seen. Hours passed in tense silence, my eyes glued to their windows, waiting for any sign of movement. But the house remained dark and still, almost unnaturally quiet. Just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined it all, a light flickered on in their front room. There they were, Evelyn and Mark, standing side by side, looking out their window, straight at me. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, their faces partially obscured by the shadows, but unmistakably focused on me. I could feel their gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on me, chilling me to the bone. I raised my camera, snapping a photo, needing proof, something to hold on to in case this escalated further. The flash momentarily illuminated the room, casting harsh shadows across their faces. But when I checked the camera, my stomach twisted. The photo was empty. There was no one there. I lowered the camera, looking back at their window, and my heart stopped. They were gone. The lights were off, the room empty, as if they'd never been there. Panic surged through me as I stumbled back, unable to shake the feeling that they were somehow still watching, even though I couldn't see them. That night, I barely slept, every shadow and creak keeping me on edge. I knew I wasn't imagining things, that this wasn't just paranoia. They were toying with me, watching, waiting, and no matter what I did, I couldn't escape their gaze. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the thought that this was only the beginning, that whatever they were planning, it hadn't even started yet. The next morning, I felt drained, as if the night had taken something vital from me. I went through my routine in a haze, every noise or flicker of movement outside making me jump. My own house felt alien, invaded by something I couldn't see, and every corner held the weight of my neighbor's silent, relentless attention. I tried to focus, to ground myself in the familiar rhythms of the day. But the memory of last night, seeing them watching, the empty photo, their sudden disappearance, made every second feel warped and fragile, as though reality itself was bending around me. I couldn't escape the feeling that Evelyn and Mark were just on the other side of the walls, listening, observing, planning their next move. By the afternoon, I was done with pretending everything was normal. I called a locksmith to change my locks, feeling a wave of relief as I watched him replace each bolt and cylinder. It didn't matter that the police wouldn't believe me. I needed some measure of control, something that gave me the slightest sense of safety. But as the locksmith finished up, I caught a glimpse of Mark standing in his yard, watching us with that same expressionless face. He nodded at me, as if acknowledging my efforts, his eyes calm, almost amused. The locksmith left, and the silence that followed seemed darker, heavier. I stood by the window, watching Mark linger in his yard, wondering what I'd have to do to make this end. But before I could think any further, I felt my phone buzz. A message notification. It was from an unknown number. My stomach twisted as I opened it. "You can change the locks, Michael, but we both know it won't make a difference." My heart pounded, the realization washing over me in waves. They had my number. They knew my name, my routines, every detail of my life, as though they had been following me long before I'd noticed. I looked out the window again, but Mark was gone, his house seemingly empty, quiet. I wanted to scream, to break something, to run, but I was trapped, surrounded by a danger I couldn't even see. I spent the rest of the day packing, throwing my belongings into suitcases, desperate to leave. As the sun began to set, I felt a sudden urge to confront them, to demand they tell me why they were doing this. It felt like my last shot at regaining control, at understanding what they wanted from me. I stepped out, walking with a determination I didn't feel, crossing the yard until I stood at their front door. I hesitated, my knuckles hovering just above the wood, when the door creaked open on its own, as if they'd been expecting me. Inside, the house was dim, shadows stretching long and strange across the floor, and the air was thick with a silence that felt alive, pressing in on me from every side. "Hello." My voice sounded small, weak. I took a step inside, straining to see in the dim light. A voice came from the living room, low and calm. "We've been waiting for you." Evelyn and Mark were sitting in armchairs facing each other but angled toward the doorway, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of a single lamp. They looked at me with that same unreadable expression, a mixture of amusement and something darker, something I couldn't name. "Why are you doing this?" I managed, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. Evelyn tilted her head, smiling faintly. "You invited us in, Michael. You chose this." My mind raced, trying to piece together her words, but they made no sense. "I didn't invite you." "Oh, but you did," Mark interrupted, his tone light, almost mocking. "Every time you looked over, every time you watched us, you were inviting us closer, asking us to join you. You wanted us here." They both stood up, moving with a synchronized precision that sent a chill through me. I backed away, feeling my pulse quicken, every instinct screaming for me to run. But my feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the very air around me was holding me in place. "Please, leave me alone," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Evelyn smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that seemed to stretch too wide. "We're only giving you what you wanted. You wanted to be seen, Michael. You wanted to be understood. And now we're part of you." They stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and I stumbled back, finally breaking free of the strange grip that had held me in place. I turned and ran, bursting out of their house and stumbling back to my own. Once inside, I slammed the door and locked it, my heart pounding, breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But the silence that settled over me felt wrong, empty, as if something had shifted irreversibly. I could feel them, somehow, even with the walls between us. Their presence clung to me, lingering in the air, the shadows, the very fabric of the house. I tried to distract myself, to drown out the memory of their words, but it was impossible. Every sound, every flicker of movement reminded me of them, of the way they'd looked at me, as if they could see straight through to the core of who I was. And then, as I was pacing the living room, trying to make sense of everything, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. "Look outside." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the phone, dread pooling in my stomach. Slowly, I moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. There they were, standing side by side in my yard, watching me, their faces blank, their eyes filled with something I couldn't understand. It felt like they were daring me, challenging me to keep looking, to accept whatever nightmare they'd brought into my life. I backed away, pulling the curtain shut, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do, how to make them stop. It felt like a game, one they controlled completely, leaving me powerless and exposed. And as the night wore on, I realized the truth. I couldn't escape them. They were part of me now, woven into the fabric of my life, a constant, inescapable presence. Somehow I knew that every time I looked out that window, they would be there, waiting, watching, making sure I never forgot. I was trapped in their gaze, bound by the choice I hadn't even realized I'd made, a prisoner in my own home, with no way out. When I first moved into the little house just outside of Boston, I couldn't believe my luck. It was quaint, nestled among tall pines, with enough space to feel private, but close enough to town for a quick commute. The landlord had explained it was an older home, built in the early 1900s, and I was drawn to its antique charm. Original hardwood floors, creaky but beautifully crafted doors, and heavy, ornate molding around the windows. I felt like I'd stumbled into a piece of history. The first week was full of settling in, unpacking, rearranging furniture, and getting used to the quirks of an old house. There were tiny inconveniences like the slow plumbing and drafty windows, but I loved it. At night, I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, listening to the sounds of the wind through the trees, feeling entirely at peace. However, by the end of that week, I began noticing small things out of place. At first, it was nothing obvious, just a faint, musty smell in certain rooms, especially in the hallway near the guest bedroom. I figured it was typical for an old house. Maybe the place just needed better ventilation. I started leaving windows cracked during the day, hoping to air it out. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, just a sense, an almost tangible awareness of something beyond what I could see. One night, I came home after meeting friends for dinner. I went into the guest bedroom to grab a blanket and noticed that the closet door was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed it earlier, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd left it open in my rush to get ready. I pushed it shut and didn't think much of it. But the next morning, as I made my way downstairs, I noticed that the door to the basement was open as well. It was just a crack, but it was enough to give me pause. I couldn't remember opening it. In fact, I'd been avoiding the basement entirely. It felt too dark and uninviting, like a place where shadows lurked in corners that no amount of light could reach. I stood there, staring at the door, before finally pulling it closed with a firm tug. I told myself that it must have been a draft. Old houses settle, doors shift. It was nothing, except the doors kept opening. Each time, it felt like I was catching something out of the corner of my eye. Just a slight movement, a glimmer of shadow, but nothing I could actually see. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. I chalked it up to nerves, to adjusting to a new place, and went about my routine, focusing on work and spending time with friends. But then, late one night, something happened that I couldn't explain away. I was cleaning up in the guest room, dusting the bookshelves and wiping down surfaces. When I bent down to pick up a cloth I'd dropped, I felt a faint but distinct draft coming from the wall in the corner of the room. It was strange, since I hadn't opened any windows, and the night was still. Curious, I moved closer, running my hands along the wall, searching for where the draft might be coming from. My fingers brushed against a small, almost imperceptible seam, a thin line that separated the wall from something else. A door? No, it didn't look like a door, at least not at first glance. But as I pressed gently against it, the wall shifted, and to my amazement, a hidden door swung open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit passage. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness. A part of me wanted to close the door and pretend I hadn't found it. But curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside, feeling the cool, stale air wrap around me. The passage was narrow, forcing me to walk sideways in places, and the floor creaked beneath me with each step. It was clear that no one had been in here for a long time, at least not openly. After a few minutes, I reached the end of the passage, where it opened into a small room. The light from my phone barely illuminated the space, but I could make out a few details: an old, stained mattress lying on the floor, a tattered blanket draped over it, and an assortment of empty food containers scattered around. It felt wrong, like I was intruding on something secret, something that wasn't meant to be found. And then I saw it, a small, weathered notebook lying next to the mattress. I hesitated, but the temptation to know more was too strong. I picked it up, flipping open the cover. The pages were filled with neat, cramped handwriting, detailing things that felt eerily familiar. The first entry described the time I'd arrived home the night before, mentioning the exact hour I'd unlocked the front door, what I'd been wearing, and even the fact that I'd dropped my keys. My heart raced as I skimmed further, each page revealing more about my routine. It described the meals I'd prepared, the books I'd left open on the table, even small, insignificant things like how I'd placed my shoes by the door. Every detail of my life was chronicled here, as if someone had been watching, recording every movement, every habit. And then I saw the last entry, written in a different pen, as though added hastily. It read, "She's found the passage." A chill ran down my spine. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to escape that room and forget I'd ever found it. But as I turned to leave, a faint sound reached my ears, the creak of a floorboard coming from the passage behind me. It was close, too close. I wasn't alone. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, clutching the notebook to my chest as I moved quickly toward the entrance. My breath was shallow, each step echoing in the silence, and my heart hammered so loudly I feared it would give me away. I forced myself to stay calm, to reach the doorway, and as I finally stepped back into the guest room, I yanked the hidden door shut, feeling the air settle around me. For a long time, I just stood there, listening, waiting, half expecting the door to open again on its own. But it remained closed, the house silent once more. I clutched the notebook tightly, my mind reeling with questions. Someone had been here, living in my house, tracking my every move, and they knew I had found them. I spent the next morning in a daze, replaying everything from the night before. The hidden passage, the small room, and most chilling of all, the notebook detailing my life down to the smallest details. My hands still shook as I clutched my coffee, every sound in the house seeming louder, sharper. I tried to convince myself it was a prank or some bizarre mistake, but deep down I knew better. I had seen the dates, read the entries, someone had been watching me, and they knew that I'd discovered their hiding place. My instincts screamed to leave, to call someone, anyone, for help. But what would I say? I could barely wrap my own mind around it, let alone explain it to the police or friends. And yet, the idea of staying here, of living in a house where someone had been watching my every move, felt like a nightmare. I felt trapped, desperate, and utterly alone. Determined to understand more, I steeled myself and forced myself to return to the guest room, to the hidden door I'd discovered. I needed to confirm that it was real, that everything I'd seen hadn't been a twisted dream. The air felt thick as I pushed the door open, stepping into the narrow passage once more. The cool, stale draft greeted me like an unwanted memory, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. When I reached the small room, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The mattress, the scattered belongings, and that notebook, its pages filled with my life, my routines. I scanned the entries again, my eyes landing on moments I remembered clearly. Dinners I'd cooked, times I'd tripped over the rug near the doorway, phone calls with friends. But there were small details, private ones I couldn't understand how anyone could know. Personal thoughts I'd kept to myself, things I hadn't even mentioned aloud. With trembling hands, I flipped to the last page again, where I'd seen the chilling line, "She's found the passage." My stomach twisted as I scanned the entries that followed. To my horror, they documented each of my reactions from the previous night, my shock, my fear, even the time I'd finally gone to bed after locking every door and window in a desperate attempt to feel safe. As I reached the final entry, I saw fresh ink, words written in a different, bolder hand. "I'll be watching." A wave of nausea hit me. I stumbled back, feeling dizzy, like the walls of the small room were closing in on me. The idea that someone was still here, lurking, unseen but close enough to know my every move, was too much to bear. I had to get out. I needed fresh air, distance, anything to escape the suffocating weight of that hidden room. Clutching the notebook, I hurried back down the passage, barely pausing to close the door behind me as I stepped back into the guest room, gasping for breath. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old wooden beams seemed amplified, loaded with unseen threats. I grabbed my phone and dialed my landlord, my fingers shaking as I waited for him to pick up. "Hello?" His voice was casual, unbothered, as if he hadn't a clue about the horror his house concealed. "It's Emily. I need to ask you something about the house," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Is there anything I should know about the history? Any, previous tenants who might have left things behind?" There was a pause, followed by a sigh. "It's an old house, Emily. Been in the family for years. Not much history that I know of, besides a few owners here and there." He seemed almost amused by my question, but I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. "And no one's lived here recently?" I pressed, feeling desperation creep into my voice. "Nope. You're the first in years. The place has been empty for quite a while," he replied. I wanted to argue, to tell him everything, but something stopped me. If he didn't know, or worse, if he did know and was hiding it, I wasn't sure how much help he'd be. I ended the call, feeling more isolated than ever. I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, feeling the walls close in, knowing that at any moment someone could be watching me. I tried to distract myself by cleaning, organizing, anything to take my mind off the discovery. But no matter what I did, I felt that presence around me, like eyes tracking my every move, unseen, but always there. That night, I locked every door and window, checking each one twice, and finally retreated to my bedroom. I lay in bed, my senses on high alert, straining to hear any noise, any sign that I wasn't alone. Hours passed in silence, each minute stretching out, thick with dread. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible creak, coming from the hallway outside my room. My heart raced, adrenaline flooding my veins as I forced myself to stay quiet, listening, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks. But the sound came again, closer this time, a soft shuffle, like footsteps moving slowly, deliberately. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked it, pulling up the camera. I knew it was ridiculous that I wouldn't be able to capture anything in the dark, but it was all I had, a small barrier between me and the terror pressing in from all sides. Just as I was about to turn on the camera's flashlight, a soft whisper broke the silence, barely audible but unmistakable. "I'm still here, Emily." I froze, my blood turning to ice. I wanted to scream, to run, but I felt paralyzed, trapped in my own bed by a fear so overwhelming it was suffocating. I forced myself to turn on the flashlight, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, only shadows and silence. The voice didn't speak again, but the feeling of being watched remained, stronger than ever. I could feel it, lingering just beyond the door, waiting, biding its time. Every instinct told me to leave, to run, but where would I go? The person, the presence, whoever or whatever it was, seemed to know me too well, tracking every thought, every reaction. The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror. I didn't sleep, barely even moved, afraid that any action might trigger something, might bring the watcher closer. I stayed still, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for morning. When dawn finally broke, the light streaming through the windows felt like a lifeline, a fragile barrier between me and the darkness that had engulfed the house. But as I looked around the room, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A single sheet of paper lying on the floor, just a few feet from the bed. My name was written at the top in that same bold handwriting I'd seen in the notebook. The note read, "You can lock every door, Emily. I'll still be here." My hands shook as I held the note, the words echoing in my mind, a chilling reminder that my every move was being watched. I didn't know what to do, who to trust, or where to go. All I knew was that, somehow, I was trapped, ensnared by someone who knew me better than I knew myself. The note stayed with me all day, each word etched into my mind. Every time I looked at it, I felt that eerie chill settle deeper into my bones. There was no doubt now, someone was in my house, someone who knew every corner, every hidden spot. I wanted to run, to leave this place forever, but the idea of fleeing from something unseen, something that seemed to know me better than I knew myself, filled me with dread. What if they followed? What if I was never truly alone? But I couldn't stay here another night, not knowing they were watching, waiting. So I decided that I'd confront this presence, whatever it was. I would return to that hidden room one last time, try to find anything that might give me a clue about who was behind this. I needed answers, if only to reassure myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I waited until evening, until the fading light cast long shadows through the house, turning the familiar into something haunting. My heart raced as I made my way to the guest room, stopping in front of the hidden door. It felt like it was waiting for me, as if it knew I'd be back. I took a deep breath, pushed it open, and stepped into the narrow passageway, my pulse quickening as I walked down the dark corridor. The small room was exactly as I'd left it, but something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a heavy silence that pressed down on me, amplifying every creak, every faint sound. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on the notebook lying open on the mattress. A new entry was scribbled on the page, the handwriting messy, as though written in haste. "She's back. She knows. She won't leave." I froze, the words sinking in, chilling me to the core. It was as if they'd known exactly what I'd do, as if every thought, every decision had already been predicted. My fingers trembled as I flipped the pages, reading entries that detailed my morning routine, my movements throughout the house, even the thoughts I'd tried to suppress. Each line was a twisted echo of my own life, distorted and captured by someone else. And then, toward the back of the notebook, I found an entry that made my blood run cold. "Tonight is the last night." Panic surged through me as I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, watching me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the notebook, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I knew I had to get out, but I couldn't move, couldn't bring myself to turn my back on the room, on the invisible eyes that I knew were fixed on me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I finally backed out of the room, keeping my gaze fixed on the darkness, as if daring it to come closer. Once I was back in the guest room, I slammed the hidden door shut, bracing myself against it, trying to steady my breathing. I could feel my heart pounding, a wild rhythm that echoed in the silence around me. I hurried to the front door, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside, locking the door behind me as if it could keep the presence contained. The air outside was cold and sharp, grounding me, pulling me back from the edge of terror. But as I stood on the porch, staring at the house, a sickening realization crept over me. I wasn't safe out here either. I had felt it, known it the moment I'd stepped outside. The presence wasn't just inside the house, it was everywhere. I spent the night in my car, parked at the end of the driveway, eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the house. Every light inside was off, the windows staring back at me, cold and lifeless. I didn't sleep, didn't move. I was waiting, half expecting to see a shadow pass by, a figure step out onto the porch. But the house remained still, almost taunting in its silence. As dawn approached, I felt a numbness settle over me, a strange acceptance that whatever haunted this place had no intention of letting me go. And then, as the first light crept over the horizon, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, on the porch, was the notebook. It hadn't been there when I'd left. I was sure of it, but now it sat in plain view, the cover open as if beckoning me to read it. I got out of the car, my legs weak, every step a struggle as I approached the notebook. I reached out, hesitating before picking it up, and flipped to the last page. The final entry was in the same bold handwriting I'd seen before. "You belong here, Emily. There is no leaving." I backed away, the notebook slipping from my hands as I stumbled down the steps. The words felt like a sentence, a declaration that I could never escape this place. Desperation clouded my mind as I raced back to my car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back. I drove until the house was nothing but a fading memory in my rearview mirror. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there. Hours passed as I drove aimlessly, my mind racing, replaying every detail, every moment that had led me to this point. By the time I finally stopped, it was night again, and I was miles away from the house. I checked into a small motel, desperate for sleep, for some kind of escape. But as I settled into bed, trying to push the memories aside, I felt a familiar chill settle over me. I told myself it was just paranoia, a lingering fear that would fade with time. But then, in the darkness, I saw it. A small, weathered notebook lying on the bedside table. It hadn't been there when I'd checked in. My blood ran cold as I reached for it, opening it with trembling hands. The first page was blank, but as I flipped through, I saw my name scrawled across the next page, bold and unmistakable. Beneath it was a single line, written in that same familiar handwriting. "I never stopped watching."